everyone. Good morning for those in Europe and good evening, Asia. Welcome to the TAP series once again, Talks on Architecture and Beyond. And it's a real pleasure to have you joining us for the last talk of the TAP second edition. And wow, I need to say wow because it's already December. And every month since January this year, the TAP series has been featuring architecture and design experts from Singapore and Southeast Asia, discussing the making of architecture on the built environment around us. And it has been eye-opening hearing how each of these masters of the craft share their respective and unique solutions on designing architecture in tandem with the natural environments and culture they are located in. Through TAP series, it is Cosentino's hope that we can learn from one another, spark creativity and inspiration in finding solutions for the climate-related challenges and opportunities we face today for a better future. For viewers who are joining us for the first time, I would like to invite you to watch the other exciting talks. We are available on Cosentino's YouTube channel. And without more delay, since we are in the last session of the TAP 2022, and we need to make the most of our speakers' time, I pass the floor to Jan from WITO, who has been curating the biannual TAP series since its first inception in 2018. Thank you, Jan, for being part of this special initiative. And I will let you to introduce our closing guest speakers. And to our viewers turning in, I hope you enjoy this session. And if you want to formulate any questions, please use the chat. See you later at the closing. Jan, all is yours. Jan, hello. I think we have some technical issues. Jan is coming.
Like, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So the floor is yours.
Very, very sorry for this technical glitch. It happened. So good evening, everyone, and happy to be here for the very last TAB talk of the year, the TAB series 2022. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Just to make sure that you can hear me well. Maria, can you hear me well?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Yes, it's been a year, an intense year of talks on architecture and beyond. We had, today is the 12th talk, so we had already 11 speakers and almost more than 5,500 views all along the years and it is counting. So it's been quite amazing with Mark and now Chantakit Niyomvanich and also DP Architect, William T from WT Architecture, Yi Cheng from Type 0, Alan Tay from Formworks, Adela and Farah from Studio Bikin Malaysia, Jen Ru from Goy Architect, and Victor and Jacqueline from Ply Studio, and Chat Architect from Thailand, RT plus Q, Real Rich from Raw Architect from Indonesia, and today for the very last talk, it's two special architects that I truly admire, that I've been knowing for many years. One of them has even inspired me to come to Singapore, so I'm very excited to have them today and for them to share with us all of their expertise and their knowledge in architecture, especially for that very talk on life and afterlife. You know that all of this year we've been talking about the making of architecture and how it requires to have this almost a slow process in acquiring this great outcome for the built environment. And the last moment in the making of architecture, it is the life and afterlife, and that's why we invited Meta Architect and Farm Architect to share with us how they've been repurposing ancient or older pieces of architecture and to make this adaptive reuse to enter the 21st century. So I will introduce our two speakers. So Adrian Lai from Meta Architects. So Adrian is a registered architect in the UK and in Singapore. He founded Meta Architect to explore the potential for cultural production in architecture, landscape, and urban project. He's an adjunct assistant professor at NUS in architecture. And today he will be talking about the Kongguan building. Kongguan, if you're in Singapore, you will of course know what is it about, which is a biscuit factory, a famous biscuit. And so he will share with us how he creatively enhanced this existing piece of architecture to make it entering into a new life. Following Adrian, we have Nanchuan from Farm Architect that will share with us the great Madras Hotel, which is located in Little India in Singapore, that won the President Design Award. Farm won the President Design Award in 2010. Award-winning team, 20 under 45 award in URA in Singapore, and has been very, very active among the architecture community. And so today the Madras Hotel, so it is to see how this building within its shell and how it has been repurposed into a new piece of life, and while keeping the strong spirit of the place. So it's very exciting. So today for the last talk we have not only one architect but two architects, and so at the end of each talk, at the end of the two talks, I will come back to ask questions to Adrian and Tran. So please enjoy the talk. So if we would have been live on stage, I would have asked Adrian to come on stage. So Adrian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jan. Thanks for the introduction. I'll share screen. Kinetica, guys. Does it work? You guys seeing?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Meta. You cannot see the full screen? See? Good. Okay, let's start. Meta Architecture. Hang on. I'll just breeze quickly through. My personal experience is of working in London, Europe. I had 2 or 3 projects in different parts of England. And then I had a brief experience in Hong Kong and Guangzhou in China before moving back to Singapore to do Gardens by the Bay. And it's here in Singapore where we find ourselves with the commission to do Kongguan building when I started Meta Architecture. We have decided not to change our name from Meta Architecture to Facebook Architecture, but maybe a little with the furore, the kind of noise around Meta now. We just thought that it's quite maybe useful and interesting for us to put forth what we mean when we say Meta. Just a little kind of understanding of how we work. We are very we look at architecture design as if we are the word meta, and we work as if we are the prefix. And meta has a few meanings. It means after, or along with, or beyond, or behind, or more than. But meta is really interesting because depending on what word it attaches to, it transforms that word differently, but actually quite fundamentally. So for example, physical is everything that can be touched and seen, but metaphysical is not it's not more of it. It means beyond it. It's supernatural. It's things beyond the physical. But metadata is actually still data, but it's data about data. So meta is a kind of interesting word that changes its meaning and what it operates on depending on the context that it attaches to. So that's a bit like how we look at architecture. We look at our context, but we look to really transform the context we find ourselves in, depending on what it is. We've started, because of that, we work on both new build projects as well as infill or kind of complex A&A projects, rejuvenation of historic districts or business areas. And here we're particularly talking about Khong Guan today. So Khong Guan has made the news, and it's made the news. We'll go back to it later, why it's important that it makes the news. But what's interesting is that the context to this project is in Singapore, in the 30 years of conservation since 1989, nearly more than 7,000 buildings have been listed as conservation, but fewer than 100 of these are modern buildings. So it's harder to make a case for heritage buildings when they are not seemingly as old. But for a young country like Singapore, where we found out we got our independence in the 1960s, it's really important that in that era, the buildings that are built are modern buildings, and that we conserve them as special, as important, because it ties in together with Singapore's early history. So my project is Khong Guan, and it's about recapturing the spirit of the modern. It is in a light industrial estate in Singapore at 2 McTaggart Road. And Khong Guan building was actually formerly the Khong Guan Biscuit Factory building, and it received conservation listing in 2005. And the history of this building is basically the history of Khong Guan Biscuit. And Khong Guan Biscuit is basically, for those who are not from the region, it's a household name. It's an international biscuit brand in Singapore. It's served in all kinds of national events, even on our Singapore Airlines first class. They serve Khong Guan biscuits, right? So it's a real national icon. It's a story of how Khong Guan Biscuit as a brand grew from a household name in this neighborhood first, from this corner shop at the front of the building. At the meeting of these two diagonal roads, McTaggart Road and Burn Roads, to become an internationally renowned Singapore brand. But then we asked ourselves, what about the building captures the stories, and which features define its character, and are the features and the stories really related? How do we do that? How do we relate architecture to the stories that are there that's worth preserving? We looked at the site, and for us, the site has two meanings here. It is both the plot property boundary, shaped by the diagonal roads, and the apex condition, the apex of the kind of two diagonals where they meet. But the site is also the existing structure and the character of the building that we need to engage with, because we have to insert, cut, join up with, etc. Right? We have to kind of work with this building. So the building itself is also our site. And the existing structures and character that we need to engage with is then the essence for us. So we look through the gazetted items. On the top, the apex is an important part that the government has said has to be kept. There is also a private entrance on the side, and there's a loading bay, a gate, a really old gate, right? So this is what the site looks like. It looked like before we started work. You can see it's a small little sliver of land where the lorry is, the truck is. That is basically the extent of the site. We started looking at the third story plan, showing the Khong Guan founder's family home. In 1950s, when it was built, 1952, the founder stayed on the third floor. His office was on the second floor, and on the ground floor, that's where the warehouse was. So you can see the layout of his home, where the sitting room was, etc. And then we looked at where how the office is now. When we first engaged in 2015, we could see that it was largely similar. They basically reused their home and became their head office. So they have this tie together with the building. We also looked at the structural column layout. and it's ordered from one of the roads rather than both, right? It's the main primary facade. The clue is that it's all orthogonal to McTaggart Road, so that is the main facade for where the operations are. To them, that is kind of the main the main facade. And if you look at the beam layouts, it corroborates. It tells us the same story. Everything is ordered, organized towards McTaggart Road. And that led us to look at the features there a little bit more, the private entrance and the loading bay gate. And the loading bay gave us a clue to search further, and we went to look for historical records. And we found that actually, even though this building was called Kongguan Biscuit Factory, it was not actually a factory. It was a warehouse at the ground floor, office on the second, founder's home on the third, and the factory is actually across the road. They used to own the site across, and the Kongguan Biscuit and Confectionery factory is actually on Howard Road, and that's where they loaded up all the stores there, and some of the biscuits are being sold at the front. So it told us how the building was used before, and it helped us understand the history of the building. The private entrance was still being used when we were first engaged. This is the staircase that was there. It led to the private family home on the third story. And so we understood from this kind of clues of looking at the structural layout of the kind of the circulation stairs and where the private entrance was, we understood the reasons behind the features beyond the aesthetic and beyond the material artifact into the historical use. And then we look closely again. The only disruption to this orthogonal beam layout is at the front, at the apex, where they start to have diagonals, perpendiculars to other diagonals. And if you look at it properly, this apex is important structure in how they wanted to announce themselves to the neighborhood. And we then looked at it, and we also realized that it was really important because when this building was built in 1952, it was the tallest building in the entire neighborhood. It was considered the landmark in the area. That was actually Singapore's first light industrial park. So it was something that's quite memorable and a lot of people's collective memory of the area. And there is this very ornate gate with the brand name and the star that a lot of people remember from last time. And from there, we started to find out more about what happened around there, the schools, the markets, why this corner shop was such a important area, or such a important connection point between the school, the wet market, the community center. It was facing all these kind of very social places. So it was part of that household name network. And so we found out the story of Kongguan Biscuit Factory, and we then used this information to look at how we can design the new building. We looked at we started by modeling all the constraints or the required setbacks and what the extension would look like, what's the relative bulk, what's the footprint, what's the maximum area that can be put in. This is what we got. We thought that the first thing is to manage the bulk of the building so that it can relate to the original conserved building better. We looked at different trapezoidal blocks. We tried to systematize it and to start to see what is the best way to relate to the building, but also to maximize the plot, so that whatever we add to the building, according to the building, the plot's constraints, the government's constraints there, the planning guidelines, we would still be able to find a relationship formally between the two. And but scale for us was not just about mimicry. We don't just want to match it. We also broke it down a little bit more. The new building extension will be for SME. So the emphasis was on the two road axis and to maintain that. So what we did was then to think about this trapezoidal floor plan that would reveal the formal qualities of the original, the kind of diagonals and the kind of facings that they have. So the original is there, and the McTaggart Road, the two roads that form the plot and the shape and the form were there. We thought that if this area, this building is going to be a warehouse storage building, then triangular spaces don't really work as efficiently as if we use if we have orthogonal interiors. So we cut out each floor. From each floor, some triangular spaces. These voids would then become sky terraces, so that you have orthogonal interior spaces suitable for storage use. And that became the module that we stacked on top of each other, so that we could then start to have the McTaggart module and the Burn Road module, and they become this kind of intertwined blocks that are rotated around that will resonate with the original, the characteristics, the spatial characteristics of the original. And the apex then at the top is a kind of rotational device that then resonates with the old four-story tower that stands out. And this was how it looked like when we presented it to the client at the beginning of the at the beginning of before construction, and this is how it was turned out in 2018. These are the sky terraces. So we have sky terraces that bring large landscape to each floor. Workspaces in there have a nice shaded breakout space on every floor, and this we have the same kind of voids with greenery in the original conserved building as well as in the extension. We have orthogonal interiors so that they can use it efficiently. And it allows in this way we allow the integration of the building between the two to have these two main elevations. And you can see here on the right side, the greenery is also a nice addition to the streetscape in the area. The apex is still the main focus. It becomes a kind of landmark device, and it maintains the characteristic of the apex of the conserved original. And it has two main elevations that respects the two roads that forms it, with the kind of abstraction of the conserved original with its horizontal layering with vertical punctuations. We then used that language and articulated the new building with the interpretation of these horizontal stacks and the vertical punctuations through the grooves, but also as the kind of vertical openings that become windows, as well as the sky gardens. And on the ground floor, the owners were really keen to keep a public engagement with the neighborhood. They took great pains and a bit of economic sacrifice by withholding their own occupation of the building. They engaged the authorities, the URA, to allow them to have this publicly accessible kind of canteen, so that the neighborhood could still come into the building and look at the building and see the conserved original, so that it's not just closed off to its environment, to its neighborhood. The interiors are now unified and it's homogenized. It relates, the language of the interiors now relates to the language of the external as well. And the owner of the building was quite happy with our design. They invited us to propose a design for the interior, and they would of their headquarters, which they will move back to this office. And we took that as an opportunity to relook at the story again. We can see that the founder's office was actually in his former bedroom. Like we said, we looked through the plans. The boardroom for the entire company is actually in his former living room and things like that. So we thought that actually occupying the old building, the heritage building, is quite important for this company, who is looking at the future legacy of the company through this building. So we proposed to them that they should remain, their headquarters should remain in the original conserved building, as well as and have a visual connection. So all this is a view from the reception. All the guests who are waiting to have their meeting will sit at the reception and look at the new building from the old building. But also the part of their building, the meeting rooms will all be in the new building, and there is this internal staircase that links the old building and the new, so that every day as part of their daily routine, the long-time staff who are still with them will move always every day in their daily routine from the old to the new building and vice versa. Continuing this this connection between the two. We again resonated the language of the architecture into the interiors. This is the reception display case beside the staircase we just talked about. This is a typical office with skylights. This is an internal staircase in the managing director's office to a private terrace at the top. And this is the combined building that we designed, and that because of its maybe quite distinctive contemporary look has attracted some attention. But the idea was always that it shouldn't be novel and distinctive by itself, but that its distinctiveness is always related spatially and formally to the original existing. So they form a whole, they can stand on their own, but that they always talk to each other. And we're very happy that because of some of these awards and a nice hip cafe at the ground floor, the decisions that were made really supported this engagement with the larger public. You see urban sketches, you see just hipsters and everyone going there. We even had wedding photos taken in front of the gate. So I think it's really important to keep memory of through the generations and through works or works where redevelopment is not put at odds with conservation, where redevelopment is seen possibly as an integration of old and new. And this is one example, and we like to think that then we're on the right track, because then recently Golden Mile Tower also then starts to have the possibility of being conserved, but being added on to not just adaptive reuse, but in a landscape Singapore, I think adaptive enhancement is really what we're keen to see happen. And this is our proposal for something like that. I'd like to end off by just acknowledging the owner, Kongguan Limited, the QP. We worked with Loa Architects at that time, and the engineers Protect. The QS was PTD Consultants, and M&E engineer were Elite, and the excellent contractors were Boon Tian Contractors. So we'd like to thank them again at this opportunity. That's it.
Thank you so much, Adrian. It's amazing because I know, of course, the building, because I've seen it published so many times and it receives so many attraction and awards. So congratulations for such an amazing piece of work. I took many notes and I have many questions, but I will keep them for later. So thanks again, Adrian. Now we will move to the presentation of Nanchuan from Farm for the Great Madras Hotel. So Nanchuan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll share my screen now. Nice presentation, Adrian. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So just a quick background about us. So we are sort of a cross-disciplinary design studio. So we have architects, interior designers, graphic designers, product designers within the team. So based on the opportunities that the project present, we will form the different sort of project teams that is made up of different designers. And so I think for the purpose of today's conversation, we just want to kind of come from this angle. And for those who don't really know the history of Farm, maybe before Jan's time, we started it 2005, organizing back then what were sort of illegal gatherings of designers sharing their work around the city. So we used to do these events called Rojak. They are sort of pop-up events every 3 months. You find them at different locations of the city, and we get about 200 to 300 people coming, and there will be 10 designers sharing their work. So it's sort of similar to what the Picha Kucha is doing at the time. So that's sort of how we started as a design society, and then we move on to taking on commission work. But because we were in that space, we knew a lot of artists and curators, and that became a big part of who we are today. Even now, we're doing quite a lot of exhibition work for the museums, and also working quite closely with the arts community, right? So the idea of exhibition design was, in a sense, that's kind of how we started. But in that way, we were very used to the idea of storytelling, narratives, and creating a spatial construct to tell stories, using graphic design, words, text, lighting, movement to curate journeys through space, along with a story to tell. So that formed a big part of our training or background, and we still do quite a lot of exhibition design work. And it then is about how do we continue that kind of thinking to some of the other works that we're doing. So the idea of storytelling, and maybe not so much about exhibition content, curated content, but we also have that interest in understanding possible potential in materials, stories in materials, and the narratives and history and memories of materials. So there are also a series of community work that we did, and also commercial work that we sort of continue that train of thought, right? So the top role is actually taking the old National Stadium wood and to convert it to benches while the National Stadium is under reconstruction. And the benches are then repurposed to form public furniture that will populate the city and eventually go back to the new stadium, right? The work below is actually an investigation for a commercial project, interior design of a Aesop shop in Wan Utama, KL. We're talking about the history of KL and that part of town as a tin mining sort of history, and the idea of looking at metal forming zinc plates and understanding the different material properties and using the material again to tell stories. The top role, it's a recent exhibition that we did in collaboration with Top Design from Japan, that's talking about the design of packaging in Asia. So in this case, we collaborated with different retailers in Singapore to collect cardboard, and again using cardboard as a main storytelling medium to communicate some of these narratives and stories within the space. So the strip below is actually a public space project that we did. In this case, the material is maybe not so much of a physical construction material, but it's the one and only hot spring in Singapore, and the idea of then the water itself as the material, in terms of its property, the temperature, the sound. So trying to find different ways to create experiences and stories with water. In this case, specifically about trying to bring the temperature down of the hot spring that is coming in or coming out of the ground at 70 degrees Celsius, and how do we cool it to 40 degrees where it's comfortable for the public to engage the space. So trying to find a form that allows the material properties, in this case the hot spring water, to cool down through a series of cascading pools to arrive at a 40-degree pool at a lower portion that makes it a bit comfortable for everyone to use. So the idea of, when we first got this topic, and the topic was Madras, I think in that sense it fit. That's kind of the lineage of storytelling, that kind of experiences that we are comfortable or we are working on. And specifically for hospitality projects, they do take on a lot more integration of between the architecture, interior, and branding teams within the company. But it also allows us to tell different stories of the building and the site. So this is a similar building that we did recently, also in Little India, for Wanderlust Hotel. but it's also going back into the history of the building that is actually an old school before it's converted to a hotel. So the idea of the different languages of the textbooks and even the rattan furniture and the very simple classroom furnitures that we are very used to. I mean, back then. And adapting it and applying some of these elements into different touch points within the space itself. So keeping to not 100% the idea of a school, because the program has changed, but to some extent retain some of the element qualities and also the other narratives being narrated in the building itself. So coming to Madras, I think this is sort of before the Wanderlust Hotel. We had an opportunity to sort of merge different narratives onto the site because there were different stories that we could tell about the building, about the story of the building itself, about the architecture of the building, and also the site, the qualities of the site. And that we thought, and even the idea of the romance of travel in that spirit, and because they were targeting a slightly younger market, so we thought that these are different narratives that we can spring together, and to find that opportunity to create what we see as a sort of whimsical and also multi-layered experience for the visitors, right? So I will go sort of into the details of some of the key thinking behind the project. So the Great Madras, it is in fact the one and only, I may be wrong, one of the few SIT flats that was built in Little India. Singaporeans will be familiar with Tiong Bahru, so that's an entire cluster of SIT flats, Art Deco buildings. So this is like only the one or two of them in Little India itself. So it was designed to be a residential building, a home. Right, so this is the final outcome of the translation of the building into the hotel. And if you look at the streetscape, very much sort of remained the same. But if you notice, in 1930s, it was flats, housing flats. And in 96, it was already converted to a hotel. And we came in about 2018 to refurbish it to the Great Madras Hotel. So it undergone a couple of changes. And as for those who are not familiar with Little India, this is really the sort of one of the key cultural hubs of Singapore, very colorful, a huge density of Indian migrants. So to some extent, the organization of Singapore in the early days was by different ethnic immigrants, right? The Chinese had Chinatown, the Malay had Kampong Glam, and the Little India was for the Indian immigrants. And to some extent of the three cultural clusters, only Little India still stayed relevant because Singapore still has quite a lot of migrant workers from India, and so you do find a lot of the original characteristics still there. Of course, multiply 100 times because of the intensity of the activities and the colors, right? So it is a very colorful and a very dynamic kind of neighborhood. So we do want to sort of tap into that kind of energy. And the building itself is from Art Deco. So we were also looking at different references of Art Deco buildings around the world. The Miami and then different regions, and trying to understand the features, the colors, and not so much only in architecture world, but also within the graphic design world, and how was Art Deco interpreted during that movement, and what were some of the elements of the graphic design styles. And we talk about this, the idea of the love for travel. So we thought it was important to bring back some of those maybe a bit more analog kind of experiences about chops that you would collect from different countries that you go to, maps and little notebooks and fantastic stories of travels. And so we tried to layer all those different experiences onto the building, of course, also working with the floor plan. So you understand in 1930s, it was designed as a 2-3 bedroom flat. You can see the original layout. The 1996 conversion to the hotel, actually, they took down a lot of the original walls and they added a lot of rooms, which in 2018, we tried to revert back to the original layout as much as we could. Of course, adding in new lifts and staircases to comply with the latest code. But we also found opportunities to add new features like a small swimming pool on the roof terrace. So as much as retaining what was the original, we also, where possible, found ways to insert new programs and activities to the space. Right. So these were some of the archival drawings that we could find. So you could see some of the original features, the Art Deco features were actually still there. So we sort of essentially it's just about repurposing and also make good and retain some of those elements. So this is how the condition of the site when we first took over the space. As mentioned, it was already an existing hotel. Not the most exciting or interesting, but these were sort of the site conditions. And as we started the work, the idea is sort of summarized in this axonometric where we wanted to create a new sort of a city living room on the ground floor where we combine the cafe, the lobby and the hairdresser into a single open space that is open and connected with the neighborhood. It's not an air-conditioned lobby, so the city flows into the space. And then the bedrooms on the upper floors will be reconfigured, but we added 2 new staircases and then a new swimming pool at the back, which is this pink color structure, right? So, and existing architecture features like the spiral staircase were retained where possible. So these are the new floor plans, the layout of the space. And so these are some of the restoration process. So you see, actually the building is kind of in quite an okay condition, bit of wear and tear, which so a big part of it is just repairing and making good. So part of URA requirement was for us to also reveal the original pebble wash Shanghai plaster finish on the column itself. So this the lower part of the picture you see on the right is actually, once we take away the paint, you realize that the original finishes were actually still in quite a good condition. So a bit of repair is needed, but that's about all. Right, and then these are some of the original lighting, the conditions of the street signage. So we sort of put back and where the original signage was, and to retain as much of the elements. So this is the spiral staircase that was at the end of the building, and so the idea was also retain and to create a sort of a feature coming down to level 1 as part of the airwell, and so visually you see it as a connected space, and then you notice this feature at the end. The other element that we did was the original roof terrace, this original metal roof. So the regulations at that time allowed us to actually change it into a new concrete roof and for us to insert a new swimming pool in that space. And so we added this sort of circular feature, and it became sort of a portal that connected the 2 houses together to create this new swimming pool feature, right? Another element was actually within the window, the apartment itself. I mean, the hotel itself. A lot of these old mild steel window was actually damaged, and so the original contract was actually to put in new aluminum windows. But then the builder actually found that again, actually a big part of the elements was still in a good condition, so they could do localized repairs as compared to a total revamp of every single window panel. So he undertook that process, which you can see created a big sort of impact to the space, because the mild steel windows, the mullion, the profiles is actually smaller, so you can create a lot of light quality into the space. So the amount of light that enters the corridors, the amount of light that enters the room are actually enhanced because we managed to retain the original metal profile. Maybe in Europe it's different, but in Singapore it's quite hard to find skilled workers. So we were quite happy that the contractor actually decided to take on some of these tasks himself. Right, so this is the sort of the final outcome of the building, the way it sits on the city. You can see it that the ground floor is actually totally open. So you can sit just by the lobby onto the sidewalk and also connect to the street. And so these are pictures of the different conditions on the ground floor. So you have the all-day dining that is just next to the street, the bar, the quieter area at the back where the residents can gather if they do want to sort of stay away from the street. And this is also where the spiral staircase comes down. This is a feature that we created for the client as a wallpaper on the living the pantry, the ground floor bar itself. Is actually a story of the 2 brothers who did this project as a gift to the father. So there's the 3 of them in the middle, and so it's also a little bit of their life story and some of their fantasies and whatnot. So captured within the mural wallpaper that is in the lobby space itself. So the rooms there are 34 rooms. So each one of them is designed with a slightly different quality and character. So the idea that if you go back to Madras again and stay in a different room, you get a slightly different experience, and so that every day is not the same. So you get a slight of a growing interest with the site and the environment. And so this is the swimming pool. We just call it the Great Madras Swimming Club. So it's actually a very small pool. So these are just some of the more slightly more cheeky elements and some of the tiles that talk about while the sun shines, and if the birds can read English, then they will see this, but actually no one else will see this because it's a conservation area. And so this is the completed outcome of the project. And so it's a very small hotel, and we're quite happy with the transformation. There are operational challenges because the owner decided to operate the hotel on their own. So there was a big sort of a learning curve. But then I also got my track the Facebook, Instagram. So we are also quite happy that the hotel has gained traction, especially with a young demographic in Singapore. So the idea of conservation maybe is similar to Adrian, that is not just retaining the heritage for the sake of keeping history, but the idea of allowing new stories to be told, right? So we are quite excited to see that it has gained a lot of fans and traction within the younger community, and potentially brought a different group of people to the site and to Little India through such a transformation project, urban transformation project, where it's not about tearing down, building something new, but it's about adding on to existing character and in a way hoping to create some sort of a change without really changing the building from scratch. So I thought that was necessary to make a point in relation to the topic today. So that's the end of my presentation. Jan, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Nantran, for bringing us through that journey and even to share with us the design process of Farm and the storytelling, the narrative that you are bringing inside such project, and to learn from this existing site to become this new hotel. So I do have many questions. I will ask the same question to the two of you because here the topic is about of course this adaptive reuse, and Adrian, you mentioned in the conclusion of your talk beyond adaptive reuse, it is adaptive enhancement. And this is something that, because we talk a lot about reusing a building to repair, to recycle, and to give it a new life. But this adaptive enhancement, it's something quite strong, because it means that we really make it even greater than what it used to be. To do that, each of you, in the way that you've been working on the project, did you have a kind of recipe, because people think that for an architect, you need to have a kind of, you can do whatever you want, you can build a new building, something entirely brand new. But in each case, it was a very strong buildings with very strong soul. And how did you approach that to really dive into this existing structure to give it this enhancements? So how was it for you? And if you can share with our audience your recipe to dive into the life of these existing buildings.
Maybe I just start with some initial thoughts. Do
you want to share slides?
No, it's okay. I think
you can stop sharing.
Anyway,
your faces will be broadcast immediately.
Okay.
I think understanding the stories and the textures around the projects that we are doing, trying to be original is really important to us. So for us, original also then has essences of the origins, and the origins make us search a bit harder. In other words, if something is original, it has certain aspects of novelty. You go, hey, that's kind of new. But if we just only chase novelty, then it's all a bit bland and superficial. So I think originality has a bit of a kind of relation to its essence. So when we are trying to find essences, we look really hard, and whether it's artifacts on site, or whether it's context, or it's old stories, we want as much as we can to find the meaningful ones, because the future use might not be the same. It might be the new relevance, and how I think the word touch point that Nanchuan used, the new touch points in the new program has to be identified to find kind of significant overlaps between essences and the future. So I think I sometimes tell the clients that conservation is not really what I set out to do when I graduated, but it just seems to be quite a quintessential thing to do, because we kind of look very hard at the things that we can bring forward. We project forward rather than just whip up something and throw it there, right? We kind of project from something. So I think that's essentially how we work anyway. So and you're talking about enhancement. I think it's interesting, because when we talk to URA and you see the literature, they always talk about redevelopment, and it's a challenge because we don't have enough land, so we have to tear things down. So how do we preserve history? And then I just think maybe again, finding the overlap between them is more the way forward than looking at them as opposites. So then adaptive reuse means you just reuse whatever's there, but then enhancement means let's look at how to maximize it, look at its future, but then let's adapt what we have to make it future relevant, right? So I want to like kind of break away that false opposite, that false dichotomy, and say let's find the overlap between development, redevelopment, and conservation, or heritage. That's kind of what I think about it.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adrian. And for you, Nanchuan, how do you react to that?
I think maybe just on your first question on the idea of the secret recipe, I think to some extent I'm also trying to imagine. I mean, if you know us, we don't. Well, maybe for our own fault, we don't really have a fixed way of working. So the Madras is a very good example where the different teams in the office actually all had a chance to share their initial thoughts, right? So it's quite an open-ended, quite democratic sort of space. And if I remember correctly, the team that got everybody excited were the graphic designers, because they brought in very interesting references that the architects and the interiors were not really looking at it from the same angle. So I think that got everybody excited, and we took on that approach, right? So I think it's not, to some extent, maybe not having a very fixed view of what heritage conservation is, because you sometimes, if you take on a heritage project, you tend to maybe potentially want to respect the site too much, or respect the building too much. I mean, if you sort of can understand from that point of view. And we worked on other projects where we realized that the building was actually totally new. It was torn down, rebuilt, but it was a fake conservation building, right? So how do you tell a story when the building itself is not original? So I think then it's just being very open about the narrative of the building, and to find different ways to construct stories and experiences, and not having or keeping as much of an open mind as possible, and to explore spaces that may not be the most obvious. But I think you need to do the hard work, right? So the research has to be there, the historical research has to be done, just to make sure that you do surface some of these narratives about the building and the site. And it's just about which part of the history do you want to latch on: the history of the street, the history of the building, the history of the movement the building was built in, and where do you sort of find that angle to go in, right? And ultimately, who's the audience that you're talking to? And so I think being a hospitality project makes it easier, because people tend to consume this kind of information. And if you work on hospitality projects, the idea of authentic travel experiences become more and more important. and therefore people are willing to stay in a very weird hotel because it's very honest and true. But if it's an office building, I'm not so sure. If it's their home, I also not so sure. So the idea of hotels has that slightly higher tolerance that people can tolerate a bit of extremes, and I think that also gives you the opportunity to push it a bit more, right? So I think you have to calibrate.
Yes, I think thanks for your answer, because it's very interesting to see your respective approaches, like one being an office, one being a hotel. And I was really fascinated by the approach of Adrian regarding the composition. And when, like, the way that you were explaining it was for me an eye-opener, because again, I've been seeing so many times the publication, but the voice of the architect is very important in that, to bring us through that entire process. And the composition is so clear that it's as if you have repeated the shape of the building at different levels, and that when you explain the lines, how you studied the horizontal lines and the vertical lines and the set of proportions, and how you multiply that to make it becoming almost like a high rise, which is very common in Singapore, high rise, but for some other part of the world, it is not so common. So in that trying to look for references within the existing drawings, is it how, when you studied them, where you could identify the set of proportions, and that it became right, it became evident in what you wanted to do for this building? Is it the way that you learn from the building?
Yeah, I think it's really kind of a hard labor process, because I like the way you described it also, because we went through many iterations and variants, but in the end, without the stories, without the justifications, does it look right? Is it by itself a good building? And I think that's kind of the measure where I always in the office, we always have this we always talk about this spectrum, and we say we need to make it so evident that someone can imagine it as well. But then, of course, then some people say then it becomes like a theme park. It's kitsch, right? If it's so evident, it's kitsch. But then if it's so abstracted, nobody knows. So where do you turn the dial? So we keep moving through iterations and having to look at it as if we are fellow. We don't know, right? We just keep making them until with the same kind of hunch, not even a very clear idea, until we find something that says, I can imagine this, and let's sleep over it, and then let's look at it again tomorrow and see can we see it without someone telling us, but it cannot be kitsch, right? So I kind of really like how Nanchen is talking about telling stories, and in a way, it's absolutely right? In a program like hotels, where people are looking for stories and kind of their spider sense is on for new narratives, it's kind of a ready audience. Whereas an office like industrial area, you hardly have that, right? So how are you able to just create something that won't really have all its story told, but then it just, if someone wants to look harder, it's there. I think yeah. So yeah, I think I think you hit the nail on the head. It's imagining the evident, and then hoping that someone who sees it also imagines some of these evidence and relates it to the story. They might find it peculiar. Why do they have these grooves that seemingly useless, right? But then they might start to understand a bit more when things are slightly peculiar. Yeah.
Yes, and in this you mentioned something in during your presentation about the building is the site. The building is the site, and so when we look at the Great Madras Hotel, you feel that the site is basically the building. It has taken the entirety of the site, and so in the case of Farm, you say that you invited the city to come in to have this urban living room, and how was it for you? Because it's not that evident to be so generous and to invite the city in your living room, or to make that entire ground floor so open that it feels so welcomed. And when we look at existing buildings, we don't necessarily dare to open up so much. Like in Kongwan, it was the same on the ground floor, to open up for the communities and to be this destination. So how was it for you? Was it a kind of very strong, bold statement in saying we open the ground floor, we need to convince the authorities in that kind of bold move? How was it for you?
I think there were a few advantages that sort of allowed us to make that move. Number one, while we know Little India to be quite crazy, actually that street is quite quiet because it's like a little nook, right? So in that sense, it allowed us to project that if you open up the space, there's an opportunity for the hotel to extend into the city. Not so much about the city occupying the space, because in front of the building is not another shop house that faces you. It's actually the gable end of a wall, right? So it is in that location that it is to its advantage, right? That's one. The second one is actually a very practical consideration, because based on the number of occupants, they needed an all-day dining, and there wasn't enough space to have an enclosed F&B on the ground floor that only served the residents. So they needed to also engage the street to make a commercial viable sense of the F&B. So that also played into the part about us opening up the ground floor. But there were a lot of other small little things that we added, like the laundromat, the hairdresser. On the other end of the building is to also for the residents to use, but also potentially for the community to come in, right? So I think these were part of the conversation, and I think the client was quite open also because they are not hotel operators to begin with. So I guess we did take advantage of them, but we got interesting feedback during, I think, one of the tours, that someone mentioned that this is a very unusual hotel experience, because a lot of people are very used to sweating off the street and enter a very cold hotel lobby that is totally separated. So they find that a naturally ventilated lobby makes a lot of sense in Singapore, because you have this in-between space while you wait for the lift and everything else, but you're in a comfortable environment. The body adjusts the temperature before you go up to your room, right? So that was an interesting thing. I didn't really think through that there were not a lot of hotels without an aircon lobby, because it seems to be for security and whatnot. But I think it's also the demographic of the rooms on the ground floor. They were actually more hostel-like. The lower floors were actually shared rooms, and the upper floors were actually the typical hotel room. So again, the combination of the use types and the conditions on the ground allowed us to make this move. Yeah, and again, the client not being hotel operators.
So you took opportunities. I think in your both responses, what I find quite amazing is the level of respect and the level of generosity. And that not only you had to study an existing structure to understand the narrative, to understand the history, to bring inside a new way of using the building with a new life, and all of this with a lot of respect and generosity. It is almost as if your position as an architect was a little bit step back to really give to the building the stage, the spotlight. Do you think that when you work on existing structure like this, an architect should be perhaps behind the scene to really give the building the stand that it needs? What do you think of this? Maybe Adrian?
Yeah. I don't know. I always saw myself, even in university, as a kind of very urban architect. Maybe that's because, being Singaporean, I don't know many greenfield sites where there's no context to deal with, and you just kind of have to dream up something. So I remember having this kind of conversations at my interview at the AA as well, just to get in, right, talking about the kind of variants of urbanism. So to me, I think I don't really see it as antagonistic to self-expression. I think of architecture actually a lot of times as a dialogue, whether it's dialogue with landscape, dialogue with landforms, or climatic responses, or even just being in a brownfield or in an interterrace between buildings, right? It's always a kind of when we're undergraduates, architecture is frozen music and things like that, right? Where you want to continue the rhythm, even if you are a high pitched note, right? There has to be a context before you, and if you don't have a kind of a lead up, no punchlines can be funny, right? You kind of need a lead up anyway. So I think it's not antagonistic to self-expression. But I do want to say something in response to this question, as well as what Nanshen was talking about his farms method. I think there's great admiration from me as well, because as architects, when we have this kind of, you're talking about respect and generosity, the kind of deep study, we do have anxieties of, are we just is this too banal? Is this too trivial? Are we just repeating something? Where does the kind of aha moment, or where does the kind of originality, right? I keep talking about it. You're projecting from something, but yet how do you not be just a translation of, an interpretation of, right? Where's that twist? Where's that? And I think Farm do that very well at Great Madras, right? The building is essentially, you might say, oh, I can see very clearly how it looks the same as previously, but it's entirely different, right? You can even feel the texture of the spaces and the programming and the kind of like dotted lights that spring up from the lift lobby towards the street. And that kind of freshness is really something that's I think nice. I think it's an admirable quality, right? Yeah. So yeah,
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adrian. So Nanshan, how do you respond to this?
It's definitely intentional, but no, I think I mean, to be honest, it's maybe a bit the same as Adrian. I think none of us, or at least both of us, even in our conversation, we've never thought that we are conservationists, and that would be a sort of area that we want to focus on. But it's sort of somehow through the portfolio of works, we ended up doing quite a bit of conservation work, right? So it's not an intentional thing, but I'm also trying to think back. Is it really stepping back to allow the building to tell the story, or it's more about us needing the building to tell the story? Because if we don't have the building, then what do we talk about, right? So it's like some of the examples I showed about even the bench. If there isn't this National Stadium wood, there is no project. Why would anybody be interested in a public bench project? It's because of the story that links back to a larger entity, So I don't think we were stepping back to take the bench from the stadium because it was just lying there. So we took it and we used it to create a program, event, a structure. In this case, you also can use it to do architecture. So it's about the architect finding narratives of the building, and you're able to construct it, reconstruct it, deconstruct it to build new experiences. And I'm actually now thinking back, if you don't have that context, it's actually quite hard to start, right? So I think it's absolutely necessary. Whether that then therefore leads us to being conservation architects, I'm also not sure, because we also do have projects that is not in the conservation space. So I think, and whether I'm just thinking through, I mean, we don't go to the level of what Adrian did to study the grid plan. I mean, the BCA drawings are truly one of the drawings that I never looked at, right? So I'm quite amazed that itself could generate so much possibilities. Yeah, so, but I mean, coming back to the question you talk about, how obvious the stories need to be, and is it too obvious, then it becomes quiche, a bit too abstract, nobody understands. So I'm just thinking through that, to some extent, the test is actually, if you were to ask Adrian or me to present the same project 10 times, actually, are we able to construct 10 different presentations, right? Which means that there are enough stories within the building or the project itself to construct it slightly differently for different audience. So that is only possible if at the point of constructing the idea for the project, you had many different ideas that you were trying to layer, build upon. So for example, Adrian had the geometry of the site. It also had the history of the family, right? There were different things that being layered on, and it will manifest itself in some corner somewhere. Half the world will not notice it, but for the family member that used to stay there, it will suddenly resonate. And maybe only one person can get it, but maybe that's enough, right? So the idea is you maybe need enough stories to stack up to create that project, and then they are either obvious or they are not obvious. But I think then that is the test. If you only had one story, then you keep repeating the same story, maybe that project doesn't have that depth for you to create a strong sort of narrative or memory. Yeah.
And thanks for sharing all of this, because it's exactly what we've been discussing on for the past 11 talks on architecture and beyond about storytelling. And while we were focusing on the process of architecture, of the making of architecture, and dissecting the process of an architect, studying, developing, generating ideas, and to implement that and to build it and so on, we realize, and I guess for our audience as well, that the life of an architect is much more than just designing buildings. It is finding stories, telling stories, and giving life to these stories. So on that note, I just would like to, because we are almost at the end of our talk today, and I don't want to let it go because it is the last talk of the year. So I'm very comfortable right now. So it's a little bit with a heavy heart that I'm about to conclude this entire year. So before I give this back to Maria, I just would like to thank again Adrian and Adrian for being here today. It means a lot to me for having us today. We had amazing speakers and architects all along the year from Singapore and the region, all of them being so excited in sharing their expertise, their way of doing architecture. And today it was a very big lesson for us on how to dive into an existing structure to give it a new life. And then at the same time, an architect being at the head of all of this, orchestrating all of these bits and pieces to create such amazing pieces that contribute to our built environment. And I'm really proud and honored and blessed that Cosentino gave us such platform for all of us architects from Singapore and the region, and I hope that this will contribute to the intellectual discussion on architecture. So thanks again, Adrian and Adrian, for being here today. Thanks, Meta and Farm, for contributing to our built environment. Keep going, guys, because we need people like you to make our built environment better for our people and for our planet. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, Cosentino, for being here and to contribute to all of this built environment as well, because Cosentino is at the forefront of innovation. So I'm giving this back to you, Maria. Thanks, guys. Maria, the last word of the last tab series of 2021, and let's see what comes next for Cosentino as well. Thanks, Maria. Thanks, guys. Maria, the word of the end.
Oh, thank you, Jan, for your very nice words. It's very exciting. Well, thank you, Adrian and Nanchuan, for the wonderful setting session. I think it's the perfect wrap up for the TAP series second edition with two incredible professionals from Singapore, where the TAP series were born. And well, I would like to thank Jan again for his dedication to putting together such a meaningful edition of TAP series. We are aware that to organize this program was not easy, but it's part of our passion, your passion, Jan, my passion, Cosentino's passion as well, to promote knowledge, education to share with others in order to contribute to build a better ecosystem. We believe that as a company, we have that responsibility as well. And as we come to an end of this edition, I hope that each of us walk away with some thoughts on how architecture can support sustainable development, how we can improve quality and longevity of buildings through design and transformation, and the little ways we can contribute in protecting this only planet we live in for future generations to enjoy. So no action is too small. It has been a privilege for Cosentino to host the TAP series, and we hope that, I don't know, welcome you again at the next edition in 2023, who knows? And once again, thank you for taking time to be part of today's talks. Remember that you can check out the other inspiring TAP talks available on Cosentino TV YouTube channel. And from all of us of Cosentino, we are in December. I would like to wish you everyone a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year 2022. Stay safe and take care. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Maria.
Thanks,
Thanks, Jan.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We are out, right? Now we are out?
Yeah.
Oh.